Hello students, welcome back to another video. Today we are looking at the Caribbean History 2021 paper 2 questions. You did hear me right. 2021 paper 2 questions. And we are going to begin. Let's go into this paper. Section A, theme 1, the indigenous people and the Europeans. Question 1 says, state one name for the meeting place for Kalinago men, and that's 1 mark. I usually encourage my students to answer their questions in complete sentence. Okay, so the meeting place for Kalinago men is called a carbet. Now, if you're wondering or if you don't remember what a carbet is, it is just a traditional structure, and it was used by the Kalinago people for gatherings if they had things that they wanted to discuss, and also for social events. And that, if your answer was a carbet, that would have given you your full 1 mark. Question 2. List 3 activities which takes place at the meeting places of Kalinago men. 3 marks. And the answer is 3 activities that take place at the meeting places of Kalinago men, which is called do you remember what the answer is? The carbet. Alright, so the 3 activities are decision making and discussions. So whenever the leaders or the Kalinago men wanted to discuss important matters, they had decisions that they had to make, they had to resolve disputes, the carbet was definitely the place where the leaders and community members would gather to make decisions and discussions. Another activity that would take place at the meeting place of Kalinago men is cultural rituals and ceremonies. So whenever the Kalinago men, they were conducting traditional ceremonies such as dances or prayers and rituals, they would go to the carbet to do their cultural rituals and ceremonies. Another activity that would take place at the carbet is socializing and storytelling. So the Kalinago men, they would gather at the carbet to share stories, to pass down oral traditions, to socialize, and also to foster a sense of community and cultural continuity. All right, so the 3 activities that I have that would take place at the meeting place of Kalinago men: decision making, cultural rituals and ceremonies, and socializing and storytelling. And our next question: explain the roles of 3 leaders in the Mayan society. All right, so in Mayan society, we know that there were several important leadership roles, and each was responsible for specific aspects of governance or religion or social order. So the 3 leaders and their roles in the Mayan society were, so I have the Hawu, which is a king or the ruler. The Hawu was the supreme leader of a Mayan city. The Hawu, he held both political and religious power and was considered by the Mayans to be a divine figure. He often believed to be descendant from the gods. The primary responsibilities of the Awu, which is a king or the ruler, included making important decisions on warfare, trade, governance, as well as overseeing religious ceremonies and rituals to maintain favor with the gods. So, one of the 3 leaders in the Mayan society was the Awu. Another leader in the Mayan society was a Akun. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but it was a Hakun. And this was the priest. So the Ajkun or priest played a central role in Mayan society. He was responsible for overseeing religious rituals, ceremonies, and also the maintenance of spiritual life. The priests were responsible also for performing sacrifices, reading the sacred calendars, interpreting the will of the gods to ensure the prosperity and health of the community. The Akun or the priests also helped to guide the Ahu in religious matters. Another leader that was a part of the Mayan society was the Batab, and this was a local ruler or governor. Now, the Batab was a leader who governed smaller regions or villages within the Mayan state. They were responsible for maintaining order, overseeing local agricultural production, managing resources, ensuring that tribute was paid to the central authority. The Batabs acted as intermediaries between the common people and the higher rulers. Question C. Let's go back up. Explain two differences and one similarity between the Kalinago and the Taino society. Two differences and one similarity between the Kalinago and the Taino society. And this is 12 marks. All right, so two differences and one similarity between the Kalinago and the Taino societies are, and we are going to look at the differences first. So let's look at location. For the Kalinago, they lived in the Lesser Antilles in places like Dominica, St. Lucia, and other Caribbean region. The Taino, they lived in the Greater Antilles in places like Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cuba, right? Another difference apart from location between the Kalinago and the Tainos was social structure. For the Kalinago society, they had a more flexible, less centralized social structure with smaller communities and a focus. They were more focused on warrior culture. The Taino had a more hierarchical structure. They had, for example, a chief, they had this chief was ruler over a large organized community. They had a more defined division of labor and roles within society. So apart from the differences between the Kalinago and the Tainos was location, social structure. Now, one similarity, one thing that was similar between the Taino and the Kalinago were agriculture. They both were very involved in agriculture. They rely on the cultivation of crops like cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes. The Kalinago and the Tainos, they practiced farming techniques that were well suited to their environments and provided sustenance for their communities. So two differences between the Kalinago and the Tainos was location and social structure, and one similarity was agriculture. So they both did agriculture. Question 2. The Indigenous had a lasting impact on the language of the Europeans. Today, many of these Indigenous words remain as part of the English language. List 4 English words which have origins that can be traced to the indigenous people of the Caribbean. And that's 4 beautiful marks, all right? So this is an easy question. 4 English words with origins that can be traced to the indigenous people of the Caribbean are, so I have barbecue, and this was a Taino word. I have canoe, I have hurricane, and tobacco. And there are many other words that you could write. This list is just 4 words that I came up with. All right, so that's easy 4 marks. Explain 3 reasons why the Kalinago were able to resist Europeans' domination longer than the Taino. Explain 3 reasons why the Kalinago were able to resist Europeans' domination longer than the Taino, and this is 9 marks. The Kalinagos, right? They were able to resist European domination longer than the Taino for several reasons. One such reason was geographical advantage. What do I mean by this? So the Kalinago, they lived on the more rugged, mountainous islands of the Lesser Antilles. And living there, this provided them with a natural barrier, and it made it more difficult for the European colonizers to access their territories, right? The Taino, on the other hand, they inhabited the larger, flatter islands, Greater Antilles, which were easier for Europeans to invade and settle. So one reason why the Kalinago they were able to resist the Europeans longer than the Taino was geographical advantage. Another reason is the warrior culture. So the Kalinago had a strong warrior tradition, and they were known for their skills in warfare. For the Kalinago, they were more organized and prepared to defend their lands and people from European invaders. The Tainos, on the other hand, they were generally more peaceful, less militarized, which made them more vulnerable to European attacks and conquest. Another reason why the Kalinago they were better able to resist European domination was smaller, more mobile communities. So for the Kalinago, they lived in smaller, decentralized communities, right? And this allowed them to be more mobile and evasive in the face of European attacks. This also made it harder for the European forces to completely overpower them. In contrast, right, the Tainos, they lived in larger, more centralized communities. So their communities were much more organized, which made it easier for Europeans to capture and dominate them. So the three reasons why the Kalinagos were able to resist European domination longer than the Tainos were geographical advantage, warrior culture, and smaller, more mobile communities. Our next question is discuss 3 ways other than languages in which the indigenous people impacted the European. Discuss 3 ways other than languages in which the indigenous people impacted the Europeans. And the 3 ways are agriculture and crops. What do I mean by this? How did this impacted the Europeans? All right, so the indigenous people, they introduced Europeans to new crops and agricultural techniques that were crucial for their survival in the New World. For example, the Taino, they taught the Europeans how to cultivate crops such as cassava, sweet potatoes, maize, and tobacco. These crops were not only important for food, but also became key economic resources, with tobacco especially influencing European trade. All right. So one of the ways that the indigenous people impacted the Europeans other than language was in agriculture and crops. Another way in which the indigenous people impacted the Europeans were navigation and boat building techniques. So the indigenous people, particularly the Tainos and the Kalinago, were very skilled navigators and boat builders. Hence, the Europeans, they learned from the indigenous people how to build and use canoes, which were essential for exploring and navigating the Caribbean highlands and beyond. So, the indigenous knowledge of coastal navigation and the use of the stars for direction also influence European exploration techniques. Another way in which the indigenous people they impacted the Europeans were in cultural practices and customs. So, for the indigenous people, they influenced European customs in areas such as food preparation, leisure activities. The Europeans, they adopted methods of cooking and food preservation, such as roasting and drying meat. The practice of using tobacco for smoking was also introduced by indigenous people, influencing European social customs, especially in the courts of European royalties. Furthermore, indigenous ceremonies and art had an important impact on European visual and decorative arts. So these influences, they played a significant role in shaping European life during the age of colonization and contributing to the building and to the blending of indigenous and European cultures in the Caribbean. So the three ways that the indigenous people impacted the Europeans are in agriculture and crops, navigation and boat building techniques, and also cultural practices and customs. All right, so we're going to go, and that was theme 1. We are going to theme 2. So guys, I hope that you are learning a lot from this paper 2. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please subscribe so that you can learn more about how to answer questions from the paper 2 Caribbean history. Guys, if you love this channel, please watch the ads in order to support this channel. Theme 2, Caribbean Economy and Slavery. Question 3. Sugar led to a change in the population in the 17th century. The African population grew rapidly, and this growth was accompanied by untold suffering. List 4 modern West African nations from which enslaved persons were shipped to the New World in the 17th century. So the answer to this is 4 modern West African nations from which enslaved persons were shipped to the New World in the 17th century are Senegal. So the answers would be Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, and I also have Angola as the 4 modern West African nations from which enslaved persons were shipped to the New World in the 17th century. All right, so if you have those answers, you are definitely correct. Our next question is, describe the 3 systems of labor that existed in the 17th century Caribbean. Describe the 3 systems of labor that existed in the 17th century Caribbean. All right, so the answer to this is, in the 17th century Caribbean, 3 main systems of labor were utilized, particularly in the sugar industry, and these systems were the enslavement of Africans. The most widespread and brutal system was the enslavement of Africans who were forcibly transported from West Africa to the Caribbean. These enslaved Africans, they worked primarily on sugar plantations, they were harvesting sugar cane, they were operating the mills, and they were also processing sugar. This system was characterized by harsh conditions, lack of freedom, and extreme exploitation. The African slave trade grew rapidly during the 17th century as European demand for sugar increased. So in the 17th century Caribbean, one of the main systems of labor that was utilized were the enslavement of Africans. Another system of labor that existed in the 17th century Caribbean was indentured servitude. What do I mean by this? This involved Europeans, and they were often from poor backgrounds in England, Ireland, and other parts of Europe, who agreed to work for a set number of years. Usually this was 47 years in exchange for passage to the Caribbean, or sometimes this was in the work in exchange for land or money at the end of their service. These indentured servants were treated somewhat better than the enslaved Africans, but they still faced poor living conditions, they still had to work long hours, and they had limited rights. However, over time, as conditions worsened and the African slave trade expanded, indentured servitude, you see that it became what? Declined, right? So let's go back to the question. One of the three systems of labor that existed in the 17th century Caribbean are, so we looked at the enslavement of Africans system, we look at the indentured servitude system, and now we are going to look at the forced labor of indigenous people. So prior to the large-scale importation of African slaves, we saw where many Caribbean islands they relied on the forced labor of indigenous people such as the Taino and the Kalinago, right? So the indigenous population was decimated by disease, so it was decreasing. The population of the Kalinago and the Taino was decreasing, and this was caused by diseases that were brought by the Europeans as well as through mistreatment, which led to the decline of the labor system. So it led to the decline of the labor system. However, we saw in the early 17th century where the indigenous labor was still used in some areas, particularly for agricultural work and in the early stages of colonization. And to conclude, these labor systems were integral to the development of the Caribbean's plantation economy, especially in the production of sugar, which was a major export. The impact of these labor systems had long-lasting social, economic, and cultural consequences in the region. All right, question C, explain four social consequences of the coming of the Africans to the Caribbean due to the sugar revolution. And this is 12 marks. All right, so let's go into our answer. The arrival of Africans to the Caribbean due to the sugar revolution led to significant social consequences, and these included, all right, so these are answers to the four social consequences of the coming of the Africans to the Caribbean due to the sugar revolution. So our first social consequences was the formation of a racial stratified society. What do I mean by this? So the introduction of African slaves to the Caribbean resulted in a rigid racial hierarchy. The white European colonists and planters, they formed the upper class, while the enslaved Africans and their descendants, they were placed at the bottom of the social ladder. This system of racial stratification created a long-lasting divisions in society where racial identity became a key factor in determining social status, rights, and access to resources. And we are still seeing this today, right? So one of the social consequences of the coming of the Africans to the Caribbean due to the sugar revolution was the formation of a racial society. Another cultural consequence was social blending. What do I mean by this? Cultural and social blending. So the Africans, they brought their distinct languages, religious practices, and cultural traditions to the Caribbean, which blended with the existing indigenous and European cultures. Over time, this mixing of the mixing of African, European, and indigenous elements led to the creation of a unique Afro-Caribbean culture. This included the development of a new language, like in Jamaica we have Creole. It included the development of music, dance, and religious practices that is in syncretism of African beliefs with Christianity, leading to the emergence of religions like Voodoo, Santeria, and Obio in the Caribbean. So another social consequences of the Africans coming to the Caribbean was demographic changes. All right, so the arrival of Africans dramatically shifted the demographic makeup of the Caribbean. All right, so by the late 17th and 18th centuries, we saw where enslaved Africans made up most of the population and on many Caribbean islands, right? So this demographic shift, it changes the social structure of the region as African labor became the foundation of the sugar economy, and European settlers and colonists became a minority in many areas. So one of the social consequences of the Africans coming to the Caribbean due to the sugar revolution was demographic change. Another consequence was the rise of resistance and rebellions. So the brutal conditions of slavery and the exploitation of African labor led to resistance and the eventual rise of slave rebellions across the Caribbean. So the African slaves, along with some indigenous people and even indentured servants, they resisted their opposition, and they did this through a number of ways. So they resisted their opposition through a number of ways. They had sabotage, they revolt, and they escape. These uprisings, such as the Asian Revolution, had profound social consequences as they not only challenged the existing social order, but also eventually led to the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas. So, in summary, these social consequences of the Africans' presence in the Caribbean shape the region's history, culture, and social dynamics for centuries. And guys, we are going to end right there. All right, so this is part one of the 2021 Caribbean History Paper 2 questions. All right, guys, please remember, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so. Give this video a like, leave a comment, share it with a friend, with your classmates, with your teacher, and please look out for paper 2 of the 2021 Caribbean History paper.